Hey, I'm so glad that you're tuning in today. My name is Jimbo Stewart. I'm the lead pastor here at Redemption Church in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a replant. I'm also the replant and revitalization strategist with the Jacksonville Baptist Association, and I also have the pleasure of serving on the replant team with the North American Mission Board. My job today is to talk to you about some characteristics of replanters and revitalizers. And so we're going to build on the original 8 characteristics that Mark Clifton and the guys gave us with some doctoral research from Dr. Stephen Hudson out of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and some of my own doctoral research. And what we've come up with is a list of 13 characteristics that we have identified are essential characteristics to revitalize or replant a dying church. One of the things that we've got to understand in replanting is this is not a B-team activity. Replanting or revitalizing a dying church is not your starter church to cut your teeth so you can get in. For far too long, dying churches have settled for dysfunctional pastors, and dysfunctional pastors have settled for dying churches because those are the only ones that oftentimes that will hire them. What we want to call you to is a higher calling, recognizing that this is a work of God. This is a beautiful reclaiming of the glory of God and shining the light of the gospel in neighborhoods. This is a high calling, and we need the best and the brightest. We need those that God has called and equipped and gifted specifically for this. So what are the characteristics? What does this look like? When Jesus is reconciling the world back to himself and using you to do that in a dying church, what characteristics do we have? Well, before we get into those, I want to recognize this, that the work we're talking about is supernatural more than it is strategic. Psalm chapter 127 verse 1 says, "Unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor over it in vain. Unless the Lord watches over a city, the watchman stays alert in vain." Unless the Lord revitalizes a dying church, unless the Lord replants a dying church, then we do our effort in vain. This is a call of God and a work that we must do for God, with God, and to honor God. But Psalm 78:72 also says this, "He shepherded them with a pure heart and guided them with skillful hands." Now, in your own context, you have to determine how you interpret what the biblical qualifications of a pastor are as Paul lays them out to Timothy and to Titus, and Peter does in 1 Peter 5. And we see those, and in your context, in your association, in your church, you can differentiate the different ways that those are interpreted. And so what we're going to talk today about is what is that pure heart and skillful hands that we found in research that God has given to effective revitalizers and replanters. To make it easy to digest all 13 characteristics, I'm not going to be able to go deep into all of them today. I'm going to introduce you to them in 4 categories: head, hearts, hands, and habits, because that's just much easier to remember. Because we have to think like a replanter. We have to think like a revitalizer. And so there are 3 characteristics that we have put out of the 13 under head. First is visionary shepherd. Visionary shepherd is really kind of 2 ideas combined into one, and that combination is necessary. The visionary shepherd has the ability to sense and see God's next steps for a congregation and the capacity to lead the church forward as a loving shepherd. A visionary shepherd is patient and wise, strategic and relational. You have to be able to lead both forward as a visionary, but also patiently as a shepherd. In that, one of the new elements that we've added out of our research is organizational awareness. Kind of the short layman's version to understand what organizational awareness is to understand the personality, the nuances, and the quirks of the church as a whole as an organization. So it's understanding the power players, it's understanding which things are kind of landmines and tough spots to talk about. As change is introduced, which parts of that are going to bring the most resistance and how to do that. And also understanding in that personality of the organization, how does that play out in the personality of the culture and the context that that church is in, the history of that church in its context. Having an awareness of all of that, the history, the quirks, the personalities of the organization as a whole is a necessary, essential characteristic of a replanter or revitalizer. And the third one for head, as we think rightly, is tactical patience. Tactical patience is the ability to know when something needs to change and how to change it. When you walk into a dying church, chances are, if you are a visionary, you're going to see about 5,000 things you're convinced need to change immediately. Tactical patience is understanding that you can't change all of those at once. And you know which ones need to change when and how to do that. And so tactical patience is an essential characteristic of being a replanter. So that's the head as we think about what it means to be a replanter. Next, we go to the heart. The heart is what's really behind this. As Psalm 78:72 said, he shepherded them with a pure heart and guided them with skillful hands. So that skillful hands part is part of that way of thinking, but we're going to get to the hands even more on that. But on the heart, that pure heart behind it, there are 3 and then an optional 4th essential characteristics for this as well. So first is gospel orientation. As a replanter, we've got to understand that this is not about gimmicks. This is not about fads and trends and statistics and the latest new book and the latest new way to change everything and cool music and cool whatever. Gospel orientation understands that replanting and revitalizing a dying church is about orienting everything to the life-changing power of the gospel. Everything. The way you do children's ministry, conflict management, the way you preach, the way you disciple, the way you do outreach, the way you think about change management, it all has to be aligned and oriented on the gospel. But also there has to be a heart of missional focus, understanding that part of replanting and revitalizing a dying church is making it externally focused and understanding that that church needs to be on mission in the community that God has placed it in his sovereign will. I love the definition that Mark Clifton gives of what it means to be a successful replant. When you are making disciples that make the community noticeably better. This is that Jeremiah 29:7 mentality and heart behind why we replant dying churches, because that community, the community I sit in right now in Redemption Church, needs the gospel. It needs Redemption Church to be on mission and care for its community. The church that God has placed you in or will place you in needs that church to be on mission and have a focus to do that. Now, the other thing in heart really gets to ourselves of a pure heart. We have to have emotional intelligence. As pastors of replants and revitalizations, you are walking through an emotional minefield. And so you've got to have self-awareness, social awareness, and self-regulation, self-control as a fruit of the Spirit. And so you've got to understand this is not about you. You've got to be emotionally intelligent enough to let people get mad and upset and frustrated with you, and you take it with patience and kindness and mercy and grace. And that takes emotional intelligence. And so those are the 3 main characteristics under heart. But for those of you that are married, we've added another one there that we call spousal perseverance. If you're married and God has called you to replant or revitalize a dying church, your spouse is going to need to be on the same page with you. Their heart is going to need to be in it. I can't think of a harder position in a replant or revitalizing church than the pastor's wife. There's just so much that comes with that. And so as a married couple, you've got to have your hearts together as one on mission, oriented on the gospel with emotional intelligence, focused on dating your wife, loving your wife, serving your wife and your family well, and pastoring your family well as they help you in this, because it won't be an easy task. And it will be trying and difficult on your marriage. And so spousal perseverance is absolutely essential if you're married. So we've got to think like a replanter. We've got to have the right heart behind it. And then we have to have skillful hands. Now, when we say hands, what we mean here is really your work ethic. Like, how is it that you go about the work of ministry that God has called you to? And so underneath that one, we have 3 characteristics as well. The first one is called pastoral grit. This one was originally called a high capacity for suffering, but we wanted to change that and give you a better understanding of what it means to not just suffer well, but also be able to lead well in the midst of suffering. There is zero doubt if you are replanting or revitalizing a dying church that you are going to suffer. So what are you going to do when that happens? Well, there's a spiritual grittiness that comes from those with a pure heart and skillful hands, replanters and revitalizers that don't just persevere, but are able to continue to lead well in those moments. It's not that we won't ever fail, but there is required a matching of passion and perseverance together for the purpose of the gospel. So pastoral grit. Next is initiative. Initiative is needed because usually when you walk into a dying church, there's going to be a sense of apathy. Things have been the same way for a long time, and so somebody's going to need to be a starter, and that probably is going to need to be you. And you're going to need to be able to see that things need to happen, and so you're going to need to be able to get the ball rolling on those things. And so initiative is needed. And then the third one is resourceful generalist. Connected to this idea of initiative, you're going to need to be able to figure out how to do a lot of things. Now, not long term, eventually you don't need to be the one doing everything. But when you first walk into a dying church, chances are you're going to need to know how to unclog a toilet. You're going to need to understand how to run a soundboard. You're going to need to understand how to do way more than just preach and go to the hospital. You're going to have to figure out how to negotiate with contractors that need to replace your air conditioner. You're going to need to figure out all sorts of things. Now, but here's the other piece to being a resourceful generalist that's absolutely essential for effectiveness, that you don't keep it that way. That as you're doing all these other tasks, you recognize the calling of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 16, and you equip the saints to do the work of ministry. And so as you're unclogging that toilet, you got another guy with you, and you're teaching him how to do that, and you're discipling him, and you're duplicating yourself in leadership, not just in the pulpit and in doing outreach, but in all things, that we're bringing people into the process. This is what will make you a resourceful generalist that leads to an effective replant or revitalization. So we think like a replanter. We have the pure heart of a replanter, the skillful hands of a replanter. And then lastly, there are 3 habits. 3 habits that need to continually be a part of the way that you approach ministry in order for you to be an effective replanter or revitalizer. The first one is an affinity for multi-generational ministry. So you have to understand that you're probably walking into a church primarily of an older generation. And you're going to need to reach some of younger generations, but not to the detriment of the sheep that God has already given you. So you can't just take an older church and just add younger people to it. There needs to be some of that Titus 2 older generation pouring into younger generation serving the older generation, and you need to be a guy that's comfortable with children and with teenagers and with young adults and senior adults and love and value all of them equally. There is a pretty high chance that if you're not careful here, your senior adults are going to feel left out and run over. And those are dear sheep that God has given you to shepherd, and you need to shepherd them well. But you need to shepherd them to care about the younger generations and disciple them to disciple the younger generations and make disciples that make the community noticeably better in a multi-generational way. The next one is respect for a church's legacy. It may be easy to find the things that need to be fixed, but a really effective replanter also knows the things that built that church and brought it to where it is, and understands that really replanting a church is going back to what started the whole thing and building back on that foundation. And recognizing this church was planted in this community for a gospel purpose. And our job as replanters is to take the church back to that and build on that foundation. And so we have to have respect for the legacy of that church and continually, for all of our time there as a pastor, build on the legacy that that church was built on. And then the last habit that I want to talk to you about is a willingness to confront. Not an eagerness, but a willingness. There will be sinful attitudes and behaviors, and you're going to need to, as a loving shepherd, confront sin. And you're going to step in a gracious, gospel-oriented way and manage that conflict and see those things as discipleship opportunities, not roadblocks. Those are opportunities for you to take somebody, love them well, shepherd them well, and confront them in a way that helps build the church up in love. See, Ephesians 4, 11 through 16 says that when each part plays its part properly, the church builds itself up in love. That's the goal here. The goal here isn't just to have a list of characteristics and try to live by those things. but recognize these are just observational research things we found that point us to what it looks like to have a pure heart and skillful hands, to orient everything on the gospel, to make disciples that make disciples that make the community noticeably better. And I'm praying for you. I'm excited that God is potentially either already called you into this or is calling you into this. And we're going to have some resources linked as a part of this that'll give you way more information on each of these characteristics, and you can dive in to figure out what those things are. But continue to pray for God's leadership over your life and that God would use you to make much of his name and reclaim God's glory in dying churches.